At some point, you couldn't say exactly when, you stopped being difficult, not in the way you meant to. Not through a decision you made consciously. You became easier, softer in the right places, more careful about what you said and when and to whom. You learned to read the room, to calibrate, to notice when your presence was welcome and when it was taking up too much space. You became someone people describe as considerate, measured, emotionally intelligent. And these descriptions are accurate. They are not wrong. But there is something else you became at the same time which is harder to name and which you have been less willing to examine. You became someone who no longer has access to the full range of what you were before. You became, in the language of moral development, good, and the goodness is real. And it is also a container, and you have not been curious until now, or possibly until this moment, about what the container is holding. The person who became this careful did not choose, consciously, to narrow themselves. They responded to a set of pressures, some external, some internal, that consistently rewarded the managed version and penalized the unmanaged one. They learned what cost them, and they reduced it. This is not a failure. It is a form of intelligence. The problem is not that the learning happened. The problem is that the learning stopped being a response to the environment and became, at some point, the environment itself. The careful person moved through the world, producing the managed version so reliably for so long that the unmanaged version stopped being a live option, not suppressed, simply no longer practiced. And the unpracticed, like the unstretched muscle, loses range without drama, without announcement, without the person ever noticing it is going. The mechanism that installed the goodness was not wisdom, it was pressure. Social, familial, relational pressure. The accumulated experience of what happened when you were not careful, not managed, not sufficiently contained. The unmanaged version of you cost something. It cost approval, or relationships, or your sense of being acceptable. And so you learned. You became fluent in what the people around you needed from you. You adjusted, and the adjustment calcified over time into character, into what you now call your values. What becomes possible when you can see that mechanism clearly, when you can distinguish between the values that emerged from genuine understanding and the values that were installed by the logic of social survival, is not the return of your worst impulses. It is something quieter and more radical. A knowledge of yourself that is not filtered through what you were required to become. The behavior I want to name, the one that probably sounds familiar in a way you wish it didn't, is the specific quality of unease you feel when someone around you is direct in a way you have trained yourself not to be. Not jealousy, not admiration, something more complicated. You watch someone say the thing you thought, without the hedging, without the 3 levels of consideration you would have applied before deciding not to say it, and something in you responds, not with approval, with a feeling that has 2 components simultaneously, relief that they said it, and a vague disturbance at how easily they could. The disturbance is the tell. It is the managed part of you recognizing the unmanaged part of someone else, and not knowing what to do with the recognition. There is also the inverse version of this, when you watch someone be more direct than the situation seems to warrant, more demanding, more present in their own wants, more willing to be inconvenient, and your first assessment of them is criticism. They are being too much. They haven't learned. They are creating unnecessary difficulty. You would never behave that way. And this is true, you would not. But the sharpness of the judgment, the particular quickness of the criticism, is worth examining. The qualities we criticize most readily in others are often the ones we have most completely disciplined out of ourselves. And the criticism is, at some level, directed at the loss, not the display. You have told yourself you've moved past that directness, that your more careful approach is evidence of growth. And in part, this is true. But in part, the carefulness is not growth. It is a habit that formed in response to something that no longer exists in quite the form it did when the habit was installed. The habit does not know this. It runs regardless. And what runs with it is the slow, barely perceptible erosion of the part of you that was most distinctly yours before the management began. If this channel is giving you language for something you've been carrying without a name, subscribe. The pressure that installed the lid is not villainous in origin. Nietzsche was precise about this, and the precision is uncomfortable because it removes the option of locating the source of the problem in a specific person or situation that can then be blamed and dismissed. There is no villain, there is a mechanism. And the mechanism operated not despite your intelligence, but in part through it, because the intelligent person learns faster what works and what costs them, and calibrates more quickly, and therefore arrives at the managed self sooner and with more completeness than someone who calibrates more slowly. Your quickness was part of what produced the lid. This is the specific discomfort of being the careful person told to examine their carefulness. The very capacity that produced the problem cannot be recruited to solve it without becoming part of the problem again. What Nietzsche identified in the Genealogy of Morals is that the moral systems most people inherit are not primarily the product of wisdom or discovery. They are the product of power. Specifically, the power of those who needed the more vigorous to become manageable. He called this the slave revolt in morality. Not a political event, but a psychological one. The moment when the qualities that made someone difficult, passion, directness, the will toward their own values, were reframed as vice, and the qualities that made them useful to others, restraint, humility, patience, selflessness, were reframed as virtue. The reframing was not a conspiracy. It was the slow sedimentation of what gets rewarded in a world organized by interdependence and approval. The important thing Nietzsche was pointing at, and the thing that most readings of this argument miss, is that the installation is not visible to the person who underwent it. It does not feel like an external force. It feels like development. The person who had the vigorous qualities and learned to restrain them does not remember a moment of suppression. They remember a gradual maturation. They remember learning bit by bit what it costs to be too direct, too demanding, too much of what they were, and adjusting each time and accumulating the adjustments into something that eventually felt like character, like values, like who they had become through genuine effort and reflection. Most of this is not false. The development is real. But the development happened in a very specific direction, the direction that the social environment required. And that directionality is not the same as choice. A river that has been channeled runs fast and clearly in one direction. That does not mean it would have run that way on its own. This is not an argument against virtue. It is an argument for distinguishing between the virtue that emerges from genuine understanding, from having faced something and come through it differently, and the virtue that was installed by the need to survive a particular social environment. The first kind knows itself. The second kind does not. It experiences itself as wisdom, when it is partly wisdom and partly a lid, and the lid does not know it is a lid, and the person beneath it does not know what is being held. Jung's framework for this is more precise than Nietzsche's because it operates at the level of the individual psyche rather than civilization. The persona, as Jung described it, is the face the self presents to the world, the role, the mask, the socially negotiated presentation of the self that allows for functional participation in collective life. Every person has one. Every person needs one. The problem is not the persona. The problem is when the persona has been inhabited so completely for so long that the self can no longer reliably distinguish between the persona and what lies beneath it. When the careful, considered, morally coherent version of you has been the primary version for so many years that the version that existed before, more instinctive, less curated, less reliably acceptable, has not been visited in long enough that you are no longer sure it is still there. Jung's claim was that the persona and the self are not the same thing. The persona is what we become in relation to others. The self is what we are in relation to ourselves. The fuller, more contradictory, less presentable version that includes the aspects of the psyche that the persona has agreed to leave out. The problem is not that people have personas. The problem is that they forget they are wearing one. And when the forgetting is complete enough, the self-knowledge the person believes they have is, in fact, knowledge of their performance rather than knowledge of themselves. Jung called what gets excluded in this process the shadow. Again, not repressed darkness in the dramatic sense, though darkness may be part of it. The shadow is everything that the persona cannot accommodate, every quality that contradicts or complicates the public self. For the person who built a highly managed, considerate persona, the shadow almost certainly contains things that are not dark at all. Vitality, appetite, directness, anger that is not ashamed of itself, desire that does not first ask permission. These are not vices. They are aspects of the self that were made socially inconvenient and subsequently filed below the threshold of daily life, where they now operate as shadow always operates, without being acknowledged, without being integrated, and therefore without being governed. The unexpected place this shows up, the place the careful person has not anticipated, is in their intimate relationships, not in the ways that would be obvious, not in conflict avoidance, which the careful person already knows about and has probably addressed, or at least intellectualized. In the subtler distortion, the careful person's partner often doesn't fully know them, not because the careful person is hiding something deliberately, because the careful person is so well practiced at being a particular kind of presence, reliable, regulated, emotionally available, that the less regulated, less predictable, less accommodating version never makes an appearance. And a relationship in which one person is reliably well managed is not a relationship between two whole people. It is a relationship between one whole person and one performance, however sincere. What the careful person's partner often experiences, and often cannot name, is a vague sense of not quite being able to find them, of reaching and getting something smooth and warm and considered, and not quite getting the person. This is not because the care is false. It is because the care has been allowed to stand in for everything else. The regularity of the presentation has become, over time, a form of absence. The managed self is always present. The self beneath the management has not been given permission to appear. The careful person often interprets this as the other person's failure of perception. They are not withholding. They are not performing. They are simply being who they are. And this is the most precise account of the problem. They are being who they are. But who they are has been narrowed over years of careful management to a subset of what they were. What this creates in the relationship is an asymmetry that neither person can easily name. The careful person offers a great deal: attention, consideration, emotional availability, the reliable absence of the kind of volatility that makes relationships feel unsafe. What they cannot offer is the quality of full presence that comes from being in the relationship as someone who has their own ungoverned interior, who sometimes wants something inconvenient, who occasionally has an anger that hasn't been processed into something more palatable before it arrives. Who can be in the relationship genuinely encountered, not just reliably experienced. The careful person mistakes this absence for a virtue. They are easy to be with. They do not create unnecessary difficulty. They manage themselves well. All of this is true, and it is also a way of describing someone who is not yet fully there. Arendt, writing about the nature of thinking, by which she meant not the processing of information, but the genuine examination of one's own assumptions, made a claim that cuts directly here. She argued that the person who does not think is not necessarily a bad person. They may in fact be a very good person by all visible measures. What they lack is not virtue, but self-knowledge. And the specific cost of that absence is that their goodness, however genuine its expression, is not something they can fully claim, because they have not examined the degree to which it is theirs, as opposed to inherited, installed, required by the social formations that shape them. Arendt's analysis was not gentle. She was writing in the shadow of a historical catastrophe produced precisely by people who were doing what was expected of them without thinking, people who had, in every visible way, adapted themselves so completely to the requirements of their environment that they no longer had access to any internal standard that could check the requirements. What she saw was that the abdication of thinking, the replacement of genuine self-examination with the automatic running of installed norms, was not a feature of the obviously wicked. It was a feature of the ordinarily respectable. This is a different claim than it sounds. Arendt was not describing the careful person as capable of atrocity. She was describing the careful person as someone who, without thinking, has no reliable way to distinguish between what they genuinely believe and what they have been shaped to believe. The behaviors look the same. The internal experience looks the same. The difference only becomes visible when the shaped norm requires something the genuine belief would refuse. And this situation may never arise, which means the careful person may live their entire life without ever encountering the gap between their performed values and their actual ones. Arendt was not describing moral catastrophe. She was describing something more ordinary and more costly. The person who has been good for so long in so consistent a way that the goodness has become automatic, and anything that has become automatic has, by definition, moved below the level of conscious choice. The person does not choose to be considerate. They are considerate. And the difference between a chosen value and an installed behavior is, in practice, enormous, even when the behavior is identical, because only the chosen value can be revised, re-examined, updated as understanding develops. The installed behavior simply runs regardless of whether the conditions that installed it still apply. The person who cannot revise their goodness, who cannot distinguish between the values they have genuinely chosen and the behaviors they were shaped into, does not have values in the full sense. They have a persona so well developed that it has been confused for a self. The complication of this argument, the thing that makes it harder than it first appears, is that the integration being suggested is not a return. You cannot go back to who you were before the management began, and you should not want to. That person, for all their vitality, did not yet know what they know now. The directness that you are obscurely mourning when you watch someone else say the unsoftened thing was not always wisdom. Sometimes it was immaturity. Sometimes it was the ordinary carelessness of someone who had not yet learned what their words cost other people. What is being lost in the management is not the immaturity. What is being lost is the vitality that accompanied it, and the self-knowledge that came with inhabiting the full range of what you were, including the parts that were inconvenient, including the parts that occasionally cost you something, including the parts that required other people to manage their own responses rather than you pre-managing them on their behalf. The integration that depth psychology actually points toward, and this is what most treatments of the shadow get wrong, is not about releasing the unmanaged self on the world. It is about knowing it, about visiting the territory that the persona has declared off limits, with enough regularity that the shadow's contents stop being alien to you, not to perform them, to know them, to stop being surprised by what you want, what you resent, what you are capable of feeling, to stop managing a self you haven't met. Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations are often read as a guide to virtue, are more precisely a sustained practice of self-examination that makes virtue possible by making it conscious. He returns, throughout those private notes, to the question of what he actually is, not what he should be, not what others require him to be, but what is actually present when the roles and the duties and the public self are set aside. The Stoic project was not the suppression of the self. It was the examination of it, relentless, honest, without the consolations that less rigorous self-accounts provide. The careful person has often read Marcus Aurelius as confirmation of their management, as evidence that the controlled, regulated, dutiful self is the realized self. This is a misreading. Marcus Aurelius examined himself because he did not trust that what he presented to the world was a reliable account of what he was. The practice of examination is not the same as the achievement of goodness. It is the ongoing refusal to mistake the persona for the person. The self-knowledge that the careful person lacks is not knowledge of their worst qualities. It is knowledge of everything that got filed as inconvenient, everything that the persona could not accommodate, and that therefore moved below the threshold of daily life, where it now influences behavior in ways the careful person cannot see and therefore cannot account for. The directness that makes them uneasy, the appetite that they reroute through the more acceptable channels, the anger that becomes mild disappointment, the desire that becomes preference. These are not problems to be eliminated. They are parts of the self to be met. Dostoevsky's Underground Man is, among other things, a portrait of what happens when the self-examination goes wrong, when the person faces what is beneath the persona and responds not with integration, but with intensified internal warfare. The underground man knows himself. He knows his pettiness, his resentment, his contradictions. What he cannot do is carry that knowledge without it becoming a source of further suffering. He uses it to torment himself rather than to become more fully himself. He is the person who achieved self-knowledge and then weaponized it. This is the risk the careful person faces if the argument that has been made here is received only as accusation. The recognition that what you call your values is partly an installation, that your goodness is partly a lid, that the self beneath it has been waiting longer than is comfortable. This recognition is not useful as self-criticism. Self-criticism is just the managed self attacking the shadow. It is not integration. It is the same avoidance with a different emotional texture. The person who walks away from this argument with a list of their own inadequacies has not done anything different from what they were already doing. They have simply expanded the management to include a new category of judgment. Now they are not only managing their behavior, they are managing their relationship to the fact that they have been managing. The question that the recognition opens, and this is where the script has to be honest about the limits of what it can give you, is not, what am I really like, underneath. That question, asked the wrong way, leads either to the underground man spiral or to the kind of therapeutic performance in which the shadow is named and nothing actually changes. The question is, what have I been making unavailable to myself? And what has that unavailability been costing the people I'm in relationships with, and the work I do, and the life I'm actually living, as opposed to the life I've constructed to be acceptable? That question does not have a clean answer. It has a practice. The practice is exposure, not disclosure, not confession, but the willingness to be in your own presence with more of the range than the persona permits. To notice what you want before you negotiate it into something more acceptable. To stay with an anger before it becomes mild disappointment. To experience an impulse without immediately assessing whether it's good enough to act on. The person you were before you learned to be good is not someone you need to become again. They are someone you need to have met. They are someone whose vocabulary you need to be able to access, whose directness, whose appetite, whose capacity to want without apologizing for wanting is part of the full range you were before the range was narrowed. The meeting is overdue. And unlike most things that are overdue, it does not require going back. It requires going in.